Hi, my name is Dr. Kamala London. Thanks for tuning in to my video. If you've watched any of my earlier videos, you know that I'm a forensic developmental psychologist, which means I study how we can use research on kids' social development and cognitive development in order to make our courtroom procedures as best as possible in order to handle child witnesses. So as professionals who study child witnesses, we need to have two goals in mind. One is we want to maximize quality. That is, we want to get out of them things that are correct, and we want to minimize inaccurate information or inaccurate stories altogether. And secondly, we want to maximize the quality of the information. So we want to get as much from them as possible, but we don't want to have any declines in the accuracy of that information. And so in my first couple of videos, I just talked about some general things about child witnesses, and I wanted to elaborate on that a little bit today. So one of the first things about many of the cases that attorneys need to deal with child witnesses is the fact that the cases are just so difficult and they are so complex in lots of different ways. But from a litigation standpoint, in terms of handling the cases, they're difficult because they often don't have any corroborative evidence. And so what I mean by that is that they don't have evidence, physical evidence, indicating necessarily if a crime even took place. Let's say if you're dealing with a homicide where you actually know there's a dead body and there may be physical signs and evidence for the investigation. Often child sexual abuse in particular allegations, they may be of the nature where physical evidence would not even have been left behind, or if in fact there was a chance even that physical evidence can be there, to the extent that children delay disclosure, which they often do, there would be no chance or very little chance of still finding any physical evidence. So typically what you have in these cases is you have a child's word that something happened, sometimes involving delays of months or even years, saying, that something happened involving typically a person who they know, often their family member, often a boyfriend, often somebody associated with the children, let's say a coach or somebody from their church or their sister's boyfriend. And in just a minority of cases do we have allegations that arise against strangers. So we've got the child's allegation, and then we have, in cases that go to trial anyway, we have the person who is accused just denying it. And if you think about what kinds of evidence can a defendant come up with if in fact they didn't actually do it, it becomes very, very difficult. In other words, it's difficult and often even impossible to prove a person's innocence. And so that is why in child maltreatment cases, the child's report is of the utmost importance. I mean, take a case even that does have some physical evidence. Imagine it's a child physical abuse allegation, and you have a child who has a broken arm. On the one hand, they might have broken their arm falling off their bike, and on the other hand, they might have broken their arm when somebody kicked them. And so the child's report regarding what happened is of the utmost importance. And so what can we do? What are the overriding principles of a good evidence-based interview? And when I say evidence-based interview, what I'm talking about are interview techniques that have been shown through controlled, systematic developmental research to lead to accurate, reliable reports from children. And so there are a couple overriding principles. One is that the interview, the forensic interview, needs to be child-centered. And by that, what we mean is that the interviewer needs to be sensitive to the child's needs and needs to let the child take the lead role. Now, often when we're talking to children, especially young children, we don't talk to them in a way that is attempting to elicit accurate and complete reports. And in fact, quite the opposite. We usually scaffold them in their memories. And so kids are quite perceptive to subtle little cues that we give them in our communication. And we do this all the time as parents, as teachers. I could give lots of examples of a very directed communication style. So if I said something, let's say, since right now we're in the midst of a pandemic and other parents like myself are all homeschooling right now, and I said something to my 7-year-old of what is 7 times 2, and he came back with 13, I would say, 13? And by just the subtle repeating of his answer, he would quickly catch on to the fact they didn't give the correct answer and change his answer. So what the interviewer needs to convey in these forensic interviews is that unlike the normal conversations that adults have with the child, this conversation is actually going to be different. In fact, the child is going to lead the show. And there are actually some really, really good ways of doing that. There has been some research, much of it by a person named Michael Lamb from Cambridge, also Deirdre Brown from New Zealand, Sonia Brubaker, Deb Poole, who have shown ways that we can teach the child early on in the interview that they are going to be the ones to do the reporting. And the good news for interviewers is it doesn't take very long. It maybe can take 5 or 6 minutes to set the interview up in this child-centered way. And now that I've been in the forensic interview world and I've acted as an expert witness in trials for about 20 years, I could say that almost without fail, I can predict the quality of that forensic interview before they even start talking about anything related to maltreatment or whatever it is they're trying to interview the child about. Sometimes children witness homicides and things like that. Within about the first 2 minutes of the interview, before they even start talking about the substantive issue at hand, I can usually say how it's going to go down. Why? Because of the way they're setting up the interview. So to sum up, the first major overriding theme of a good forensic interview is that less is more in many ways. The job of the interviewer is not easy. So I'm not saying less is more in that regard of them just not having to say much. In fact, the really important role of the interviewer is to set it up well. They need to, provide this early kind of tone or atmosphere to the interview that is then going to allow children to give good, complete reports. So it should be child-centered. Another big component of an evidence-based good forensic interview is that it takes a hypothesis testing approach rather than a hypothesis confirming approach. And what I mean by that is that you want the interviewer to go into the interview with an open mind. You don't want the interviewer to go into the interview thinking, well, I already know what happened. This mom came in and gave this big elaborate history of whatever it is that her child told her. And now it's my job as the interviewer to get that information out of the kid. When interviewers have this, what we call hypothesis of confirming approach, they tend to use questions that elicit what they already think and believe. And you see this in studies. There's just a huge foundation of research across cognitive and social psychology that when people have pre-existing beliefs, they tend to move forward in forensic interviews and in other ways to collect information that confirms their beliefs. So lots and lots of studies. I'll give you a couple quick examples. In some research, college students were told that a certain group of mice were particularly smart mice, and another group of mice were particularly dull mice. And the job of the college students was to get them to run a maze. And unbeknownst then to these students, these mice, they were not tested to see how bright or dull they were. They were completely just picked out of a hat. Well, guess what happened? In fact, just by giving college students that little bit of information before they went forward to train their mice or rats was enough to lead to differences in how quickly the mice and rats run the maze. And it's all because of these beliefs, these expectations that the college students had. And so lots and lots of other examples. That's actually even been done in schools where teachers have been told certain students were gifted and these students were picked at random out of the classroom. And sure enough, what happened? At the end of the year, you saw these students who were just randomly selected to be the supposed gifted students actually made larger improvements. So the important thing to remember is a lot of this is unintentional and people aren't even aware that they're doing it. And so these teachers, just because it was ingrained in them and they thought that these students were gifted, behaviors in a student that they might have otherwise thought, well, this student is being like a slacker and they're not doing their work. Instead, they'll interpret it in ways like, well, they're such a gifted student, they're going to do their work differently. And so the teachers actually interpret what the children do in different ways based on this information. It's really hard for us then to set aside our pre-existing beliefs and to conduct a hypothesis testing interview. So a hypothesis testing interview is one that tests out different hypotheses for why the child is before them. So if a child came before them because they made some kind of statement in the bathtub about touching involving their father, the important thing, one of the many different important things that the interviewer needs to keep in mind is that it isn't necessarily inappropriate touching that took place. And I know this may seem blatantly obvious, but I think that's probably the biggest and most pervasive problem that we see in forensic interviewing is that interviewers they'll shape the questions in a certain way to elicit the information that they've already been told at the outset of the interview and shape the kid in that direction. And the other thing that I see as somebody who has reviewed a lot of forensic interviews as an expert is that the interviewer will actually disregard and just gloss over when the child says something that's inconsistent. Let's say that the interviewer suspects that touching took place under the clothes, and the interviewer says to the child, was that over or under the clothes? And the child says over. Moving forward a little while later, you'll see that interviewers just go back to assuming that it must have been under the clothes in light of the other things that the child has said. So the bottom line is, interviewers need to be really careful to realize that their jobs are one of objective truth-seeking. It's not one to be a partner with the prosecutor in order to collect evidence to confirm what they think. Because the bottom line is, kids can say a lot of weird things. And couples, when they're in the midst of a divorce, can really think a lot of bad things about their ex-partner. that may not in fact be what they think it is. And if it was all what we thought it was, there would be no reason for a forensic interview. And so those are the two big components that we want to see when we're looking at forensic interviews with children. So I'm going to end there, and next time I'll talk more about what are the different steps that we can take in order to be sure that our interviews conform to a child-centered, the kid is doing most of the talking in response to open-ended questions, and a hypothesis testing versus a hypothesis confirming approach. So as an expert witness, I'll talk more next time on how I create a timeline of anyone and everyone who's ever talked to the child, and we're going to map out not just in the formal forensic interviews, but also in any potential informal conversations that the child has had with peers or with parents. There are potential sources of information there. And then also, once then you get to the forensic interview that hopefully is recorded. Now, I'll talk more about recording next time and the importance of recording. I think we could have a whole video just on that topic. But how can we basically analyze that forensic interview in order to evaluate whether they did do a good child-centered hypothesis testing interview, such that we are able to have faith in the statements that were elicited out of that child. So we have to think of the child's statements as a bit like fingerprint evidence or anything else that you would collect in forensic science. The child's statements, they're evidence, and we want to make sure, just like we want to make sure blood is collected in a reliable way, we want to make sure that ballistics are collected in a reliable way. We want to make sure, particularly in cases where the child's report is the only evidence in the case, that those statements are collected in a reliable way. Final note, we're not attacking the credibility of a child in any way when we do this sort of reliability analysis. It has nothing to do with this individual child. And in fact, think of it quite the opposite. What you want to ask yourself as an attorney is, if we took any child, if we could pluck any child off the street, including, my own children, my 3 sons that I have, if we put them through the process that this child went through in the course of the investigation or in the course of whatever it is that went on with their family, would you expect a child to give reliable or unreliable reports? So that is the heart of the reliability of analysis. And we'll talk more about that next time. I don't know when you'll be watching this, but I'm filming it at a time where most of the country is under stay-at-home lockdown. So besides wrapping up the video, I just want to say that I hope everybody is staying safe and well out there. All right. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I hope you found the video helpful. Thanks. Bye-bye.